I guess the assumption was that even though the government can be incompetent, they still have your best interests in mind. And the system, including the judicial system and the lawyers, would suss out the things that are wrong and hold people accountable. But as things started to progress, I noticed there's nobody coming to help us. How come no lawyers are standing up and filing lawsuits? Why is everybody just rolling over?
At the same time, they're taxing the daylights out of us. And so it's like they're using our money against us to fight us. So if they're not with us, if we can't convince the Crown on certain cases, then you're basically fighting against the system that's taxing you, which is crazy.
The irony now is that the government is clearly going out of its way to offer MAID to veterans, to offer this to the mentally ill, to offer this now to what I saw in the news was just sickening, to minors. The nation as a whole, when Trudeau went out of his way to say, hey, folks that aren't getting behind the whole COVID thing, you're racist, misogynist, and we're not going to tolerate it. We gave up mind, body, and soul for this country. I believed in it so much that I was like, I'm going to put my life down and go fight in a country that you deem to be necessary to go fight in and kill other people in.
That was not right. I don't care about your politics.
Principled approach.
Principle before personalities.
The dissemination of ideas, which is the most dangerous thing to any tyrant, is the dissemination of ideas throughout history, right? COVID, MAID, I think it's just the death throes of a set of institutions that just can't coexist with the modern reality of the internet and interconnectivity. Hello, folks. I'm sitting down with Daniel Freiheit, and I wanted to have a chat with him today because he's been showing up on my feed quite a bit on X. He's one of the very few lawyers in Canada that took the last, 4 years when it comes to infringement on civil liberties and looking at things from a legal perspective very seriously. So I wanted to have him on the show and a little bit about Daniel. Daniel's a Canadian trial lawyer and the founder of Lion Advocacy, a firm focused on protecting civil liberties and medical freedom and constitutional rights across Canada. Daniel has been at the forefront of legal challenges against vaccine mandates, lockdowns, and government overreach, advocating for informed consent and bodily autonomy in the courts. His legal work has become a critical part of the national conversation around personal rights and freedoms during times of crisis. He also happens to be the brother of David Freiheit, better known as Viva Fry, a popular YouTuber and political commentator who has gained international attention for his legal analysis and live stream coverage of high-profile cases. And funny enough, I started tuning into your brother because I was like, oh, this dude's from Montreal. Like, he's got a Montreal accent. Oh, that's cool. And he was one of the few voices that was actually saying something during this whole craziness. And then I found out through Catherine Christensen, another friend of the podcast, that I should definitely follow Daniel, his brother, Lion Advocacy, doing a lot of the same stuff. So that's how we got put in touch. So thanks to Catherine for linking us up. So Daniel, thanks for hopping on the podcast. And how are you doing? And then if you don't mind, why don't you give us a little bit of background as to why you got into becoming a lawyer and why the advocacy piece?
Why I became a lawyer, that's a long conversation. That we don't have time for.
Cole's Notes.
Cold Notes was that we just were bred on it, born and bred in the whole legal atmosphere and the critical thinking environment. Think for yourself. They form conclusions based on a sequence of thought, but justified thoughts. By the way, I like your intro a lot. I'm going to actually steal some of that if that's okay.
Absolutely.
On the trial lawyer part, I wouldn't really call myself a trial lawyer. I'm more of a corporate commercial specialist. I do help out, and I have been involved in trials. But that skill set of actual in the court is usually have other lawyers to help me with that. But yeah, so just like I say, law was kind of how we were raised. A lot of cross-examination when I was a child on different things that came up in my life, So I had to learn how to defend myself.
Sounds like you got into a lot of trouble, Daniel.
No comment.
No, good.
Nothing on the record. Answer. People that knew me I was always a comedian and a bit of a jokester and like to test rules and understand rules growing up. So that's how I got my foray. So in terms of, then over the years kind of developed more of a specialty in the corporate side of things, which was interesting because during COVID, that created a very interesting, unique, I wouldn't say opportunity, but a lot of stresses in the corporate law governance world. So I started to see things from the legal perspective in terms of corporate governance, different, employment law, different areas of the law, and how COVID, the response to the virus and this response generally was kind of impacting this whole legal thinking. So that's kind of what pushed me into it. And so, yeah, once I saw that a lot of lawyers weren't taking issue with some of the weird stuff that was going on, I was like, started scratching my head, like, we got some problems.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And funny enough, folks, if your German is half decent, Freiheit means freedom in German. So I think it's only fitting that you became a lawyer. I think probably it was foretold that you'd be a lawyer or somebody that's advocating for freedom, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't know the full history of why that name was chosen. I suspect when we fled Spain in the 1400s or something, somebody just had the great idea of freedom, and then they just took that last name. I don't know.
I love it. It's a badass last name. So that being said, you just said there weren't a lot of lawyers kind of picking up the torch on this. And I noticed that too, because in my mind, being very naive, having never dealt with the courts, COVID was a really big learning curve for me about pretty much everything. I thought I knew everything there was to know, right? Kind of cocky, like late 30s, fought in the war. Turns out I didn't know anything about our system because I just assumed that, I guess the assumption was that even though the government can be incompetent, they still have your best interests in mind. And the system, including the judicial system and the lawyers, would suss out the things that are wrong and hold people accountable. But as things started to progress, I noticed there's nobody coming to help us. How come no lawyers are standing up and filing lawsuits? Why is everybody just rolling over? I don't understand what's going on. So I'd like to know, do you have a understanding as to why? Was it just plain fear? Did they, I don't know if lawyers, you have boards, but were they essentially threatening anybody that would come out and say, hey, if you come out against this, that's it. We're taking your ability to practice law. Is that what happened?
I think, well, personally, I think there's two issues. One is just that the pandemic impacted the practice of law and how we were mobilized to do our work. So there was a lot of stay-at-home orders that affected lawyers, or that was recommended, if you didn't have to go into the office, to stay home. So it just affected our practice in that regard. The courts closed. So there's that aspect of it. And then, we are people, right? So we had our own, during lockdowns and the restrictions, kids aren't going to school. So lawyers kind of had to deal with their own personal stuff, myself included, who's going to educate these kids during the day. It created just that administrative aspect. There were a lot of lawyers that I think that were quiet, that were doing work, and they're not as vocal as folks like me or my brother or other lawyers that started getting out there. But there were lawyers out there that I learned and that I discovered over the years that have done some good work. And so I don't know if they were as vocal or if they were being censored or muted, but they were there and they were doing.
Hey folks, as you may have seen, I just got back from a BJJ and healing retreat for veterans put on by David and Cordy from Becoming Ohm, a husband and wife team doing incredible work for veterans' mental health. But my involvement with them actually started before that. I've been working with them in their online coaching program for the last 3 months, and I'm already signed up for 3 more. What I love about this program is that it meets you right at where you're at. You don't have to fly to Mexico or go sit in the jungle to start healing. They help you make real changes in your day-to-day life while teaching you how to work with plant medicine in a safe, intentional, and grounded way. This isn't some weird hippie stuff, but like a legit way to improve your mental health. For me, it's helped me stay more present with my family and respond better in situations that used to set me off. They've worked with over 100 veterans, first responders, and civilians in the last couple of years. If you want to learn more, go follow them on Instagram at becoming.ohm and shoot them a message with the words "hard to kill." David will hook you up with all the info plus a special offer just for listeners of the podcast. Becoming Ohm has been a huge part of my journey, and I know that can help you too. Even if you've been let down by everything modern medicine or Veterans Affairs has to offer you so far.
The work behind the scenes.
Okay. And I guess one of the things that I'm noticing too is that we're not nearly as litigious here in Canada. And when things started to get really serious, especially with the Canadian Armed Forces and, the 330 individuals that filed a mass tort for essentially abuse, it was abuse of power. So it wasn't just related to the vaccine. Some took it, some didn't. It was the massive abuses of power within the Canadian Armed Forces. And really, this was a bombshell case. This was the largest court case against the Canadian Armed Forces in history, yet there was zero coverage of it. And Catherine Christensen, who took this on, was the only lawyer that was really willing to go to bat, because ultimately, as soon as you go up against the government, you're fighting a losing battle. And now that I've seen how this system works, it makes sense that most lawyers don't want to take this up. I'm just curious to know that what traditionally is it something that's frowned upon, or that most lawyers don't even bother because they know that going against the government is going to basically exhaust all your resources, and they're just going to wait it out for maybe a decade until you either lose hope or no longer have any cash?
It's a good question. I think the funding is a bit of the problem because the money is not like it is in the States. In the States, they are better funded. The reward is higher, so the lawyers are more prepared to take that financial risk. If you're successful in Canada, your damages are much lower. There's precedents in the States for, depending on the claim, but you're getting hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. You don't get that in Canada. You'll get token damages for constitution. You don't get token damages. Nowhere near the same. So in the States, you'll have advocacy groups that their funding lies on the contingency payouts or the big settlement payouts. And then once they take that money, they'll keep funding more litigation to protect more rights. Canada, we don't have that. So we have to rely on the Crown to do a lot of work. At the same time, they're taxing the daylights out of us. And so it's like they're using our money against us to fight us. So if they're not with us, if we can't convince the Crown on certain cases, then you're basically fighting against the system that's taxing you, which is crazy.
Yeah. That seems like it's like the snake that's eating its own tail. There's just this endless loop of, well, in order for me to fight you, the Crown has get behind me with my money, but they're using my money to fight me. It just seems so insane, the whole system that we set up here. And I don't have a solution, and I don't know where things are going to go from here. But ultimately, we've got a whole stack of issues that need to be addressed. I'm hopeful that having conversations like this and bringing them to light, especially to the people that aren't truly aware, and who I'm talking about specifically, it's my mom. She watches the show and she's like, what are you talking about when you mention MAID? What are you talking about when you're talking about the trucker convoy? There's this black hole of information where it seems bizarre because we're information rich these days. You can't go anywhere without being overwhelmed by information. But it's clear that certain individuals are curated their information, whether it's due to the algorithm, whether it's due to the fact that they're not on the internet, whether it's they're just watching TV, et cetera, et cetera. So the point of this conversation is I want to tackle a few issues, and two of them pertain to, obviously, the Canadian Armed Forces, and specifically the MAID issue and the COVID issue. So I'd like to tackle the first one, which is MAID. I want to eat that big frog first. It is such a messy subject, in my opinion. And when I reached out to you, I actually wasn't tracking how deep your research and how much your family involvement is in the MAID issue. So this is going to be a great way to kind of get me up to speed and get the listeners up to speed. But to make sure that folks are tracking what's going on in the veteran community, here in Canada, there's been approximately 12 veterans that have been offered medical assistance and died by Veterans Affairs Canada. There's been one lawsuit that's been settled, an NDA has been signed, so we're not going to get the details of that, but there's been a payout. There's another lawsuit of an individual that was on my show last year talking about what happened to him and his ordeal. He's suing back for millions, and that's Catherine's lawsuit. Another claim just came out, it was in the media just before the election, for another veteran being offered MAID. Now, this is clearly a pattern here in the Canadian Armed Forces and with Veterans Affairs specifically. To the best of your knowledge, like, what do you think is going on here? Because this clearly is something that's happening nationally within this one organization. And it's with an organization that deals with vulnerable people that are literally calling for help. They're not at the point where they want to kill. They are at the point that they want to kill themselves, but they're also at the point that I need help right now from you, but they're being offered MAID. Can you give us some insights as to why you think that might be happening and what you think is going on here?
Well, I think that the conversation backs up and starts with just as a general policy and a legal framework shift, which is that we want to expand MAID, or we want to legalize MAID, which was done based on a court case, a narrow court case. But the idea of expanding it to different groups now is based on a lower Quebec court decision that wasn't appealed, which is very bizarre for something as sensitive as this. So there was a bit of exploitation by, I think it was Justice Lametti at the time, who decided not to appeal this lower court Quebec decision, which expanded MAID to the mental health issue, and I think even possibly minors, I'm not sure. So there has been a bit of a cultural shift about what's, normalizing MAID generally and then expanding it to other cohorts in particular. But, as I like to say, it's creating some gray areas that are getting darker and darker, is what I like to say. Well, I don't like to say it, but that's the reality, is that you're getting the way it's evolving is it's just kind of getting looser, and I don't know who's doing the oversight. We're talking about something where if you get it wrong, it's a criminal offense. So I don't think people have to understand this. And, but boards of hospitals are kind of acting with a bit of impunity. I don't know who's developing their policies, who's watching over them, who's offering, like what policy offers it to vets who are calling in for help. Like, I guess that goes to VAC, but all these things, like who's doing the oversight? The Crown, police, no one's over you. So that's an area, I have other work that I have to do, but this is an area that I'd like to, put some time into, like doing a bit of oversight. And there are cases out there where, people should not have been offered medical assistance in dying, especially when they're at their most vulnerable, whether it's in VAC or outside of VAC. So that's an area of concern.
Can you give me a little bit of background on the legality of MAID? Like, where did it come from, and why are we, as far as I know, the leading nation when it comes to, and I'm talking, I think I'm talking in absolute numbers and relative numbers for, what's the best way I can describe it? Like, mating your citizens. So I think it's the fourth or fifth leading cause of death here in Canada. So where did this policy come from, and why do we have the laws now in Canada that have, obviously been used and enacted so rapidly, in my opinion, and with such, I guess you want to call it reckless abandon? Where did it all come from?
I think the original case was a charter case, and that's kind of like the unchangeable or non-negotiable aspect of MAID, which is that if someone's basically being tortured through an illness, it's cruel and unusual not to let them just kind of expedite what's inevitable. So it's based on a kind of sensible idea, relatively sensible, depending on your personal beliefs on the matter. But it's based on this idea that, someone being tortured to death by an illness, where it's inevitable, just let them expedite it and plan it in advance. And that's kind of, reasonable for a secular person to kind of, to wrap their head around that if someone is going to die. And even if you go back to biblical times, I think there was a case of where one of the leaders was inevitably going to die and asked his assistant to basically expedite his death or fell on his sword because his death and torture was inevitable. So, right. So that's kind of like a precedent in a way for this idea. But the Canadian government repurposed that case, that Carter case, and and I think it's connected to our public health generally, that because we're a system where public health is paid for by the general purse, the way this thing's going to grow is that, like how much does it cost to keep people alive at the end of in different situations? Can we develop a policy that's just going to, move things along and save the public money? And that's why I think it's guiding a lot of the policy.
That's a really slippery slope, Daniel. Hey, it's going to save us money.
Oh, well, there's a public document analyzing how much is going to save depending on the number of deaths. It's like over 100 million, 150 million generally. So that's definitely factors into it. By the way, and to your point, yes, Canada as the world leader, like I was shocked when I saw California, same population pretty much, and the number of medical assistants, of number of maids was like significantly, like 10x or something crazy. And California, that's why I was like, oh man, what's going on in California? People should move there if their joie de vivre is so much better, right? So
I agree.
It's a problem.
Okay. I don't know if you're familiar with Captain Semra. So he was a captain early on in the Afghan war who wrote a book called The Taliban Don't Wave. He was court-martialed and drummed out of the military for essentially mercy killing a Taliban who got shredded on the battlefield. I'm talking like no legs left, just that's it. He's toast. So he put a bullet in him, warrior to warrior, you're done. I'm going to put you out of your misery. And Canada saw it fit to drum him out of the military. He's like, that was a war crime. We don't accept that here. The irony now is that the government is clearly going out of its way to offer this to veterans, to offer this to the mentally ill, to offer this now to what I saw in the news was just sickening, to minors, to 12-year-olds, to have them be classified, and maybe you can help me with the term here because I think it's a legal term, but was it consenting minors, something to that effect?
Not mature minors?
Is it mature minors? So that to me is ugly, and it brings up, I don't know. I truly believe in good and evil, I don't know if this is the case, but there's something that brought something up primal in me that was like, oh my God, this is fundamentally disgusting. Do you know what's going on there, and can you expand on it a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I think the idea is that some minors are able to make certain decisions on their own, right?
Okay.
And even if you look at the legal systems of different traditions and cultures, the age the age of consent in some countries is 14. In Canada, it was 14 until recently, or relatively recently. The age of medical consent is 16. So you're dealing with, on a global level, wrestling with what is the age at which a minor under Canadian law, under 18, is actually mature enough to make certain decisions on their own. And when you think about it, like if you actually analyze it, it is kind of arbitrary that at 11:59 p.m., when a child is 17, right? And the clock.
You can drink now, by the way. Just like you can go get smokes, you can go drink.
Right. There are legal fact scenarios that are so absurd that, someone, at 11:59 criminal offense, 12:01 a.m. not a criminal offense to, for minors under 18 to serve alcohol or whatever. So there is that arbitrariness of it. Plus, like I say, in certain, religious traditions, I go through it, but 9, 10, 12, 13, and around the world, we do recognize that, these people are able to make certain decisions by themselves. So that's kind of what where there's questions that are being exploited, that uncertainty is being exploited by, but it's not really. So the minors, from what I understand, is not a very popular topic. And I don't think that would pass in the House. I think that was one Quebec leader who was like, let's do this. Let's go after the minors. And so no offense to people who live in Quebec, my former hometown, but you've got some crazy politicians there that are eager to do some wild stuff.
Yeah,
so
tell me about it. Quebec, I mean, I know you haven't been here for a while, but we were just talking before we went live here about just the nonsense of being Anglophone here and just being a citizen here. I've lived here my whole life, and I always get the same question. Oh, you're in Quebec? What are you still doing there? It's always the same. You say you had the same reaction. What are you still doing there? And like I said, it was because of love and family. That was the only thing that kept me here. It definitely wasn't economics. I can tell you that much. And it definitely wasn't the politics. I'm not wanted here. And I guess we can move into the conversation about how we were treated. And this was targeted specifically, I think, at the Quebec speaking population, but the nation as a whole, when Trudeau went out of his way to say, hey, folks that aren't getting behind the whole COVID thing, you're racist, misogynist, and we're not going to tolerate you. He said it in French. And I think that was intentional because he knew it probably wouldn't go viral in French. Because you're not going to go translate. It's not going to be picked up by American news. It's not going to get picked up by British news, even Canadian news for that matter. And I was telling you before we went live here that conversation he had on that talk show, when I heard that, I'm still chewing on the anger, because especially as a veteran, and I know other veterans that have felt the same way. We gave up mind, body, and soul for this country. I believed in it so much. I was like, I'm going to put my life down and go fight in a country that you deem to be necessary to go fight in and kill other people in. I said, hell yeah, let's go. And then when I come back to have a prime minister say, because I have a differing opinion, that I'm not going to be tolerated in this country anymore, that set up a lot of visceral reactions within the community and myself. So you made a post on X not too long ago. And actually, that was one of the main things that I wanted to engage with you on. I was like, oh my God, this is like the only guy that's talking about this. Because in my mind, I'm like, how can a prime minister say this? How can he go out and basically threaten an entire country with being intolerable? And your post here is question: did you feel threatened by Trudeau saying the unjab take up space and essentially should not be tolerated? Would you be willing to identify yourself, swear, affirm an affidavit detailing how this threat impacted your personal safety and well-being? What happened there? Because it seems like you got inundated. Was there an overwhelming response to that tweet? Let's get into it.
Yeah, it was. And the Rebel News picked it up too. And the goal wasn't a civil, it's not a civil lawsuit, the class action. I mean, maybe it's just that the time has kind of passed and that's not really the interest. The interest here is having those statements independently reviewed. Because had you made those statements against any other identifiable group or protected group, identifiable group, substitute whatever he said about in terms of taking up space, how do we tolerate them, about any other group in Canada. So based on religion, based on gender identity, he would have been hauled out of that building, PM's, he would have been held out, and there would have been election, and then, there would have been an investigation. So people who are defending him in that statement are trying to qualify it on the basis of, if you look carefully at what he's saying, and they draw like this Venn diagram. He's talking only about the people who are misogynist, racist. He's only talking about those people. But actually, if you look at it and what he followed up with later, shortly after that, he wasn't implying that everyone was fiercely against the vaccine, had no justifiable explanation. Even in religious and medical, was like, it wasn't justifiable. And many people think that. So that means that you've just lumped everybody in there, and you're making statements that do potentially cross the line, in my view. And that being the case, what are the next steps? Let's have it assessed by some crown attorney that's independent. Let's have a JP involved. People that are independent, that haven't expressed strong views in the past about, have them assess it and say, you did cross the line, sign a peace bond, lifetime peace bond. Because
what's that?
Well, it's like for any criminal offense that's not worthy of a charge, there's other ways to handle it, like they did with, like they were looking at with SNC. I don't know if they had that then, but they're called deferred prosecution agreements. And under the criminal code, there's also peace bonds people can sign. Even under common law, there's this concept of a peace bond. So meaning you could just agree on this resolution. Instead of, we're not going to go down this whole criminal process. We're just going to sign a peace bond. Never do this again. Never say that again. Don't talk that way. And then we're all good. Because a lot of Canadians, a lot of Canadians have issues with some of the statements that were made and whether they crossed the line. So that, to me, I think is the most reasonable way to resolve this.
So it's an admission of guilt with no trial and no consequence, like there's no jail time or anything that requires the supervision.
Right. That's a good question. I forget if a peace bond, I don't think it's an admission of guilt. I don't think it appears on a record. So, right, I know it's a creative solution. And I think that's why a lot of criminal lawyers, we have to check with the criminal lawyers on this, as would I. But yes, whether a peace bond shows up on a search, I think after the year, I think it's no longer, it doesn't show up. But I got to double check that. But the idea is just, peace bond, which is what we all want. We all want people to renew their vows as Canadians, because I think a lot of MPs have forgotten what their vows were. We saw that during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've called this the era of accountability. We entered into this era where I think this was just decades in the making. Now that I understand Canada a little bit better, we've lived with this idea that the government, good governance, we can trust them. We don't need to keep our eye on it. We can just go do our thing, work hard, play hockey, watch Hockey Night in Canada on Saturday. Everything is good because when you look outside, everything was. Why would we have any reason to question it? Healthcare was good. Schools were good. Crime was low. And we had this kind of arrogance that we were better than the Americans because we had this system that works way better than them. But over the last 10 years, that's long gone. That is so far gone. And to hold politicians accountable seems almost like an impossible task. Because let's be honest, I was joking with my friends the other day. If we wanted to start a criminal enterprise, we don't need to become black market gangsters. We just need to get into politics, and then we can run all the schemes we want and be open about it, have commissions about it, and there's no charges laid, and you keep all the money. And that's literally what's been going on. So let's game this out. Okay, let's say there's a peace bond on Trudeau. It's agreed to. Okay, what are the next steps? Because we had the Emergencies Act, which was deemed to be illegal. We had the crushing of the trucker convoy, and we just had due process basically thrown out the window. People's bank accounts were just closed. Where do we go?
Well,
how do we get to the bottom of this?
And your prior chief defense staff, who the independent review, the grievance committee, was it? The external review?
Yes.
Violation of the section of the charter. Okay. What's the follow-up now? Anybody doing that? I know Catherine's on it, like a hound, and that's great. But that's a lot of work for one person. They should be establishing the Senate should be involved, because the House of Commons not, because now Carney's got control. The Senate has got to now get involved. And I think maybe that's because yes, it's more of a political solution than it is illegal, because the legal is so slow, but it is an option. But yeah, they've got to really get the Senate involved and say, holy cow, we got to do more. Now, there are a lot of people that say, well, look, the Senate's now captured. We can't even get the Senate because Trudeau appointed how many of the senators, right? And some that holds extreme views or very, on some of the political spectrum. So yet we're in trouble there too. So I wish I had the answer in that regard. But I was like, just call an election and then we'll win. And then they call the election and oh my gosh. Then the priority shifted. Everybody got distracted. Like, we got to vote against Trump. So everybody got distracted. Wait, hold on. You have a government that's like unlawfully invoked the Emergencies Act. They probably didn't have legal authority to freeze bank accounts. Like, don't forget about that. Like, no, the tariffs, elbows up. I'm like, we've all forgotten. Or they've all forgotten.
I don't think, no, but I'll push back on that. I don't think they ever knew. To be honest, like, they didn't forget. They just were willfully blind. There's something that I'm becoming more aware of. Like, this isn't a left and right issue. This is, your last name, freedom. This is whether or not Canadians value freedom or not. And I think the overwhelming majority don't. It's not something that's written really into our Constitution like the Americans. The Americans have to earn their freedom. As ridiculous as it sounds to a Canadian that you didn't like the British taxing you a little bit, oh, boo-hoo. That's kind of like the Canadian attitude. It's like, no. We didn't want taxation without representation. We didn't want to have the thumb of the British on us. We were fed up, so they revolted. Plain and simple. And so within their culture, their society, it's baked into them. Is it New Hampshire's live free or die? Where do you see that in Canada? This idea of freedom, where do you see it?
I'll push back with you. I think people do want their freedom, but they only notice it when their freedoms are impacted. For example, okay, I was trying to pressure the Law Society of Ontario, the Ontario Bar Association during COVID, during the lockdowns, during the Emergencies Act. I'm like, guys, we got to that's not right. What they're doing over there in Ottawa. Like, we know it, everybody knows it, like, because the Emergencies Act does affect the practice of law a bit. It makes it difficult to get into the red zone, puts solicitors' trust accounts at risk, depending on how, not majorly, but it could. It could affect how lawyers are, if there's surveillance, is the surveillance targeting the lawyer-client relationship as well as, So they're all like, nah, it doesn't really affect us. But now guess what happened, Dave? Now there's new tax laws coming down the pipes. Then the tax laws are making the lawyers potentially snitch on their clients for doing certain tax planning techniques. And so that's now the Canadian Federation of Law Societies is like, whoa. Solicitor-client privilege is actually like the bedrock it's like built into our Constitution. We can't just ask lawyers to start snitching on. So now they're involved in that, in tax amendments. I'm like, that's great. I'm with you, not political. I totally agree with you. Solicitor-client privilege is amazing. Where were you during the Emergencies Act? Where were you during all that stuff? So sorry if I'm yelling.
Please do. This is a yelling friendly podcast.
Right? Like, it's not, I would gladly defend, I don't care how anybody identifies. I don't care what protected group you fall under. I'm going to fight for you. If, even if you have, anyhow, like, don't get into specific cases, but I've got cases where I don't agree with the politics, but I agree with the cause, and I'm fighting like a maniac because even though, I'm not on a political thing or with the substance of what was done to you, whether it's by a regulator, whether it's by the government, that was not right. I don't care about your politics.
Principled approach.
Principle before personalities. Principle, this isn't like, but unfortunately, and then going back to politics, I guess, the prior 10 years, and look, maybe Harper was like this too. I wasn't into politics back then. But the past 10 years have really, made things so political that I can't even, it's interferes with every aspect. Things that shouldn't be political are political,
I'm sure to speak to that, I'm sure you're probably getting lumped in with conservative right-wing politics.
Thankfully, I've stayed out of the foray. Rebel News is the only one that really covers me in detail. When at the beginning of COVID, Law Times was talking to me, and I've behind the scenes corresponded with CBC. I'm like, bro, you got to correct some of that stuff. They don't give me credit, but I don't care. Just stuff with the vaccine that they weren't reporting on accurately. I've gotten to change some minor stuff. I shouldn't be politically connected. My brother's a far right. He's been labeled as whatever.
I find it so funny that I like your brother. 15, 20 years ago was clearly a lefty. Pretty much everybody here in Montreal. If you grew up in Montreal, you're pretty left. we grow up with everything, every culture in the world. We speak a bunch of different languages. We hang out with a bunch of different people, which was traditionally very leftist, very socialist, in my opinion. And now all of a sudden, like I get lumped in with like, I get people like, oh, you far right assholes. I'm like, far right? What are you saying, man? Like, I
Yeah.
live in Montreal, like the most diverse city, in my opinion, I've ever been in my life. It's insane that things got flipped on their heads. And just because you mentioned being principled, if you hold the line on your principles, that's something that I'm not seeing on the left. They'll blindly follow their ideology, whereas I'll flip flop. I don't have anything based on an ideology. I have things based on right and wrong. I consider myself a Christian, so that helps guide me. But aside from that, politics, man, like, yeah, I comment on it because I see things that are wrong. And it just so happens to be it's the left-leaning people that are in power right now that are doing all the wrong things. But I'd be equally critical of anybody on the right as well. So that being said, like, I mean, I want to just touch on the COVID thing for a little bit as well. And when it comes to informed consent, and maybe you can clear this up for me. I've had friends that have been tied up in the courts for being accused of, I'll call it SA because I don't want my channel to get a strike. And there were false allegations proven to be false in court. Okay. And it's because years later, the accuser took back their consent. They said, oh, no. Okay. Well, that sets a precedent because from what I understand, informed consent means you can take it back later if other evidence comes out to change your mind. How does this apply then to, let's say, taking the vaccine? Because I took it, but now I really regret it. So is there anything there legally that can be brought against? And let's be honest, Trudeau as a prime minister, and I knew he was doing something wrong. I'm like, dude, you cannot be saying go get a medical treatment as the leader of this country. That is so freaking wrong, but he's doing it anyways. Is there something there?
For kids. This is a good question. I mean, I think the issue, look, comparing them is difficult because they're under two different areas of the criminal code, from what I understand. But the intimacy of an injection, of something going into your body, penetrating the skin, penetrating every cell of one's body, there is kind of like there's an assault there. It's not sexual, but if a person didn't willingly undergo that treatment, there is an assault there potentially. And I've spoken to a lot of people who don't want to come forward, and it's very upsetting to me that they'll confess to me, I do feel assaulted. I accept that I was assaulted from this. And I'm like, what are you going to do about it? They're like, there's nothing I can do. And I'm like, I hear you. I'm not going to force you to testify or to, but these are like people that at this point, almost like they belong in a witness protection program more than anything, right? Like they have to, I'm like, let's get you, come forward, tell your story. You're not going to be you're not going to be hurt. No one's going to stay anonymous. We'll anonymize you entirely. But it's important that people document the assault because there were people with more credentials than myself, with more expertise in the medical space. They're not lawyers, so when they say they feel assaulted or that they'll claim that they were assaulted by this, I took it to get on a plane. I don't know the reason. I had no choice. That's okay. What is that? What do you call that? What does a Crown attorney want to call that? That's an uncomfortable conversation because then the Crown attorneys, depending on which position they took during COVID, they're kind of involved too. It's such an awkward conversation. I don't even know where to start, but it has to start. Someone's got to take So to your point, yeah, can you vitiate consent based on new information? I think there's just based on the way people were coerced in the first place, based on the information that was known, that was hidden from people. There's enough to say, hey, Bonnie Henry, you had emails coming on like a maniac and you didn't tell anybody? You knew certain lot members were affected. You didn't tell anybody? I mean, I don't know. It's dicey.
I think when the problem is so big, because let's be honest, if you start peeling that open, and the Americans are starting to, right? And once you start peeling that lid off the can, everybody's implicated, left and right. And the way I see it is that unless there's a massive upswell from the people that are like, we're holding you accountable, we're holding you accountable, we're holding you accountable. And whatever that accountability looks like, it's going to happen. So get ready. Unless there's a general upswell of accountability, and I'm not talking violent, I'm talking like, hey, We have the power. And that's what I think we forgot. We're the ones in charge, not them, us. But we just can't organize. But from what I saw during the trucker convoy, being on the ground there, the government freaked the fuck out. They've never seen that in Canadian history. And it made them realize, oh shit, they were talking about they were convinced we were going to overthrow the government. That was not the point. That was not the point. There was no weapons involved. It wasn't a violent overthrow, and they couldn't wrap their heads around the fact. So in my mind, they were so convinced that everything they did was so wrong that of course they're going to rebel with weapons. And I was like, oh, that's how bad you thought it was? Oh shit. So it's worse than we even thought. That's how I perceived it. You know, being in the military, like violent revolution, like I've been to a place that had violent revolutions. Violent revolutions happen because it's so egregious at the top that you have to overthrow the government. So they were thinking, well, what we did clearly was that bad, whether consciously or subconsciously, that of course they're going to try and overthrow us with bullets and bombs. So we didn't. So that's the only way I see us moving forward, is having large scale.
And by the way, and for that, there wasn't enough evidence during Freedom Convoy to really form that conclusion. And that's what justice was it. Right. So once an independent person in the federal court looked at it, they're like, I think you're making up a story. The factual matrix doesn't support the narrative that so where did you get your information from? Miss Freeland, where did you get your, Mendocino, where did you get all this stuff from? Oh, well, CBC. And then, but you're paying them and you're feeding them crap. So yeah, the whole cycle is, and you make a good point. The fact that they know that what they did was so egregious that that's what they were worried about when there was no evidence.
When there was bounty castles and coffees being served. Actually, do you know where a lot of the Canadian intelligence came from to justify the EA came out of? No. It was a veteran. Jeremy McKenzie was a podcaster, very outspoken, way more outspoken than me. And he created in a drunken podcast, this theoretical nation of diagonal. And its head of state was a goat tripping out on mushrooms. Clearly parody and joking, right? This is in official CSIS documents. And if you read the EA, the justification, they were like, no, he's organizing a right-wing army. He's a veteran. He knows how to do it. He served time. He was in jail, almost got killed. It's if you look at this story, it is so bananas. You wouldn't believe that this would be a G7 country putting together an intel package to justify the EA.
Is the theory that, so they relied on Jeremy McKenzie. I know that there was some discussion about his authenticity or whatever, but is the theory that was created, or he didn't reflect, he was a small minority that didn't reflect what was actually going on the ground?
Or he wasn't involved in the trucker convoy. He wasn't there. He was, as far as I know, he was in prison. But it was the idea that his podcast and his followers, they had the slash and folks kind of latched onto it because it was just a way to identify your gang colors. And he was charismatic, and they were petrified that he would actually organize. We can see this in the veteran community, a friend of mine, Jody Minnick, as well. He was taken down by the government because he was getting a little bit too powerful in the Liberal Party. He was a councilman in Ottawa. People loved him. He lost his legs in combat, a lot of credibility. And they took his ass down too, shut down all his accounts before he got really popular. And so it's a common theme that as soon as people challenge power that definitely have the population that would support them, the government will go to the most extreme measures possible and try to end that as quickly as possible. And I think now we kind of know what the game is, and people are starting to get wise. And it's because of folks like yourself that are talking on shows, on podcasts, and actually being an advocate for a lot of our communities. And I have to say, Daniel, a lot of the reason why I like what you do is because it makes me feel like I'm not crazy. Honestly, I don't know if you have other veterans or folks reaching out, thanks so much for just making me feel that I'm not crazy, because I thought I was freaking insane for such a long period.
Well, you're assuming I'm not crazy too. So I've got to actually also check my sense of reality.
Right. And it's just, once you find that community, you latch on and you go, oh my God, I'm not insane. Or at least maybe I'm not insane, but at least if there's nobody that thinks like you, maybe you're nuts. But if there's a whole community and you're a lawyer and you're from Montreal originally, it's just, oh my God, okay, cool. I'm not out in left field. This is somebody who's got a valuable legal opinion. So I'm not nuts. Everybody else is nuts. Now it's time to fight and put together a coherent argument. So I really appreciate what you do and what you're doing in the space, because it gives guys like myself just a little bit of a time to reflect and just be normal and realize that I'm not nuts. So thanks for that.
Well, and thanks for pointing that out, because this is what I do is like, sometimes if I form conclusions, I want to let people know how I formed the conclusion or the opinion to show that I'm not entirely crazy. And, or has the world gone crazy, or how different groups, right? And so, yeah, when it comes to a lot of with the Canadian government in particular, because like, give an example, like encouraging kids to get the COVID vaccine now, is this normal? Like kids as young as 6 months, like what is normal? Like, to me, that seems insane. So, I'm going to check, okay, what the different provinces do? What does the world do? This is how you test your validity of your opinion to see if you're totally off the charts. And most jurisdictions do not have kids 6 months old and over getting the COVID vaccine. And now CDC just changed, what was it, today or yesterday? Now they just updated it. What new information did you have? So a lot of these things, invocation of the Emergencies Act, I'm like, am I going crazy? How did you possibly invoke the act? And a bunch of us signed this thing and submitted it to, Toronto Sun. We had that published, and we're like, I think you're going crazy with the Emergency Act. 4 years later, the federal court says, yeah, that was crazy. So it is nice to have a group and followers that, we can bounce ideas off of. And sometimes I'll tell people, I think you're crazy for believing something. And then they'll challenge me like, this is how I feel. So we have this discussion, and it's really valuable. I do enjoy it.
Yeah. And that's the beautiful part of the internet. I mean, there's the ugly side, but then there's the amazing side, which allows folks like us to connect, which normally, unless we bumped into each other downtown Montreal somehow, in another life, we probably wouldn't connect. And I definitely wouldn't be doing this podcast because that wouldn't even be possible. So the dissemination of ideas, which is the most dangerous thing to any tyrant, is the dissemination of ideas throughout history, right? This is the X factor that is throwing a monkey wrench in the plans, in my opinion. And I'm an optimist, so I believe that we have to go through this in order to get to the other side. This last era, COVID, MAID, I think is just the death throes of a set of institutions that just can't coexist with the modern reality of the internet and interconnectivity. And that's just my working philosophy for now. And so I appreciate you sharing your opinions. I know we need to close up shop here. We're heading close to the end of the hour. I want to make sure that you promote your mother's book. We're talking about MAID, and apparently she's been huge in this space. So Daniel, let's get that book up there.
I can't really get it.
It's a little bit blurry, but let's.
It's called Life Before Death: Stories of Love, Laughter, and Loss in Palliative Care. A lot of people wonder why I'm promoting my mom's book. She wrote it like 10 years ago. She won a coin from the Senate for her work in palliative care. Yeah. And we grew up in stories of the stuff. And again, I don't agree with everything in the book, but first of all, it's family. I pay my mother royalty and she is royalty, but it's important that people understand that the life before death, like that we didn't always have this approach to palliative care to offer MAID to everybody. That wasn't what we did. We invested in care, whether it's VAC that should be doing this, or whether it's other hospitals and other, nonprofits. Let's reallocate. Where's our money going as a federal government, as provincial? Where are we donating our money? What causes, why are we offing our own citizens rather than reallocate? I know other issues are important, not deny, but just a bit of change so that people don't have to take MAID. So buy the book. It'll allow me to, buy subscriptions to the Oxford English Dictionary on my, that I rely on a lot. You can buy it at, what do you call it? buymeacoffee.com/Lion Advocacy. And it's one of the items there in my wish list.
Awesome. We'll put that in the description so folks, you can go find it right there and get yourself a copy and get yourself informed on the issue. It's easy to get upset about issues, but part of the cycle is you might get upset initially, then go do your research. Don't just take it at face value. And then the more you understand, the more you can learn, the more you can be an advocate, and the more you can talk about these important topics with friends, family, or even start your own podcast and talk about them there. So Daniel, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for your insights. Where can folks find you, and where can folks learn more about Lion Advocacy?
Just on Twitter as of now. So you go on Twitter and look up @Lion Advocacy, and you'll see all my how to connect me. You can DM me there. I also do a corporate commercial lawyer. That's Lion Law, and you can find me there at Lion Law PC on Twitter.
Awesome. Love what you're doing. Keep it up. Hopefully we don't have to use you in the future, but I think we're going to require a lot more Daniels out there to bring a bunch. I said bitch, bring a bunch more accountability to those that require it. Let's put it that way, and we'll sign off from there. So, folks, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and help this channel grow. And don't forget, train hard, fight easy. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.